I am the director of Onward. We are a centre-right think tank focused on levelling up opportunity and strengthening the social fabric everywhere in the UK, particularly in those places where both economic opportunity and social fabric are weakest. And I'm delighted this morning to welcome you to a session on reclaiming populism, how economic fairness can win back disenchanted voters. This session has been kind of spurred by a new book of that name by Eric Protzer and Paul Somerville, who I'm delighted are here to talk a little bit about their research. And it gets into a number, well, I think probably the big political theme of the last 5 years or so. We've had from Brexit and the election of Donald Trump to the Gilets jaunes in France, elections in Germany and Italy, a vast swathe of Western countries. I think a kind of wave of populist sympathy and voter disenchantment that we've been grappling with in this country and in other countries. While the evidence of voter grievance is very strong, I think analysis on what is driving it has been there has been a big debate about what is driving it. I'm not sure we necessarily have all the answers, but this book poses, I think, some new answers to that question, positing that it is not kind of unequal outcomes, but unequal opportunity that is driving much of that disenchantment, and putting forward some really quite interesting and radical solutions for addressing voter grievance in a way that harnesses that populism, that actually genuinely responds to those voters' demands and reclaims populism as it does in the title. So I'm really interested to get into some of these themes. I'm delighted, as I said, to have Eric and Paul with us. Just to introduce them briefly, Eric is a research fellow at Harvard's Growth Lab. His research has been cited by numerous global bodies, including the UN and others. He, I think, was with Thomas Piketty last week in Paris, kind of talking about some of these big themes and debating some of the causes of voter disenchantment. Paul is an entrepreneur. He founded an e-commerce firm. Previously has run for I think the Canadian Parliament twice, and been involved in political debates as well as his business interests, and they are the co-authors of Reclaiming Populism. We were going to start by I'm going to start by inviting Paul and Eric to give a short 10-minute presentation on their research, just to kind of root this discussion and ground the discussion in some of their key themes. I'm then going to come to two of, I think I can say this, Britain's leading political thinkers, Paula Surridge, who is Deputy Director of UK and a Changing Europe, also the co-author of the recently published General Election 2019 book, which is kind of the gold standard in kind of summaries of what happened at the ballot box, and one of Britain's leading political scientists as well. And then I'm going to come to Nick Timothy, who is an old friend and colleague of mine, but more importantly is the author of another book on kind of one nation conservatism and where that should go, which has, I think, a lot of sympathy with some of what Eric and Paul write about, and also a former chief of staff in Downing Street and special advisor in the Home Office to boot. So that's enough from me. You're not here to listen to me. I'm delighted to hand over now to Eric and Paul to give their presentation, then I'll come to Nick and Paula after that. Eric.
Brilliant. We'll just get our slides up here. Can you guys see that all right? Fantastic. Paul, take it away.
Will, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Somerville. On behalf of Eric Protzer and myself, we very much like to thank Onward for inviting us here today, Will for extending the invitation, and Katie for all the arrangements. We are tremendously grateful for Nick and Paula taking the time to prepare and join us today. Today, we want to focus on two things: why populism strikes hardest when the economy is unfair, and how to build a fair, socially mobile economy. Eric and I started working on reclaiming populism 3 years ago, and soon discovered that the political debate did not adequately speak to economic fairness. This insight opened the door to demonstrate that the main theories of what causes populism were wrong, particularly income inequality, and also allowed us to prove the centrality of economic unfairness. Reclaiming Populism shows that a combination of policy failures have in key high-income countries both weaken the extent to which opportunity is equal and reward is according to contribution. Two important consequences are low social mobility and high vulnerability to economic shocks. Thus, the life chances of an important share of the population are to a large extent predetermined by the income of their parents, leading many citizens to conclude that the system is rigged. This understanding is at the heart of the populist challenge. We argue that to rebuild fair, socially mobile economies, policymakers and politicians must embrace the twin virtues of equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. Countries that succeed with this twinning are today highly socially mobile and populism resistant. A key overarching conclusion of our book is that constructing and maintaining economic fairness is very difficult. The most successful societies nimbly navigate new challenges, adjust course, and ultimately pass on their cultural genes many generations into the future. The least are rightly consigned to the dustbins of history. Eric will now present our findings.
Brilliant. So before we start, I just want to show we've got a discount code for anybody interested in the book. It's 30% off. It's IME21. Just go to politybooks.com and search for the book. And with that, we'll get into the material. So as Paul mentioned, we're going to talk about two major themes of the book today. One being how populism strikes hardest when the economy is unfair. And second, how to build a fair, socially mobile economy from a policymaker's perspective. And let's start with the first of those themes. So our book contends in Reclaiming Populism that citizens are angry not due to income inequality, but more specifically to economic unfairness, which entails the sense of being unfairly held back from success because opportunity is not equal and reward is not according to contribution. When that happens, whether a citizen has had an unlucky start in life or is being knocked down by an economic shock, a system in which the economy is unfair makes it very difficult for those in precarious economic positions to get ahead on their own merits. And that in turn leads to the perception of a rigged system in need of forceful correction. Vitally, fair economic outcomes are not the same as equal economic outcomes. Fairness entails equal opportunity, but then different fair and unequal outcomes depending on each individual citizen's contribution. And once, in fact, we separate out these two concepts of fairness and equality in terms of equality of outcomes, the evidence from the behavioral science is quite clear that, in fact, there is a very strong preference for fairness and not so much for whether outcomes are equal. In this quote from the paper, Why People Prefer Unequal Societies, Starman, Sheskin, and Bloom write, for example, there is no evidence that people are bothered by economic inequality itself. Rather, they are bothered by something that is often confounded or confused with inequality: economic unfairness. We further show in our book that people are not just sensitive to the concept of economic unfairness, but that actually there is a statistical relationship between the incidence of economic unfairness and populism. And one of the major ways we do that is by investigating social mobility. And by social mobility, we mean that we look at places where there is low social mobility in the sense that individual economic success in a country or a region strongly depends on family wealth. And in that situation, low social mobility is a very, very clear violation of economic fairness because you're having reward according to your family origins instead of according to your talents and effort. The research that goes behind the book into that demonstrates, in fact, that low social mobility is a robust statistical indicator of the geography of contemporary rich world populism, both across and also within high-income countries. And conversely, alternative explanations such as income and wealth inequality, immigration, and social media use are not. That particular research linking low social mobility to populism has been cited in official documents by the United Nations, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank. It's being featured by Brookings. And critically, Professor Philip McCann of the University of Sheffield, who coined the term geography of discontent, cited that research behind the book in a recent research paper to write that social mobility is the crucial indicator of populist voting. Now, if one is concerned with the extent to which the economy is unfair and people are being unfairly held back from success, the next natural question for any policymaker is, how do you rectify that? How do you build a fair and socially mobile economy, which is something that our book uniquely delves into in quite a bit of detail. Right from the get-go, we need to clarify that social mobility has nothing to do with simply whether government is big or small. It's not like you might often hear in popular discussion. In this chart here, on the horizontal axis, we have government spending as a share of GDP in 2019. And on the vertical axis, we have countries arranged according to high social mobility at the bottom of the chart and low social mobility at the top of the chart. And you can see that countries with low social mobility span the gamut. You have places like Switzerland and the United States, and to an extent the United Kingdom, that are small government places with low social mobility. But at the same time, there are countries like Italy and in particular France that are low social mobility, but also have very large governments. So it's important to abandon that sort of traditional political perspective and think more carefully about what are the specific policies that actually underpin a socially mobile economy. And we argue in Reclaiming Populism that the most socially mobile countries specifically use policies that enable two twin pillars: equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. You can think of places like Australia, Canada, and the Nordic Scandinavian countries that pair state-sponsored equal opportunity with very competitive markets. And you can recognize quickly that these places are socially mobile and are also quite arguably populism resistant. So you can think of how Australia and Canada, for instance, have not had to deal with anything such as the backlash with Trump in the United States. And in Scandinavia, in spite of the huge shock from the 2015 European migrant crisis, those countries have not had to deal with anything such as the institutional shock of Brexit. And their vote rates for populists, for example, in the 2019 European Parliament election, were below the European average at about 20%, as compared to, if you look at places like Britain and France and Italy, it was a lot closer to sort of 30 to 50%. In contrast, places that fail on either of these twin pillars suffer the consequences. For example, the US has very competitive outcomes, but it does not support equal opportunity. France has world-class public services, but it regulates and taxes away the fruits of success. Both of these countries suffer from low social mobility, and they have fierce populist movements. In turn, these pillars of equal opportunity and fair unequal outcomes depend on many policy inputs, which we categorize in detail in the book. And vitally, these go far beyond the traditional discussion of just education. You can imagine how equal opportunity does depend on things like education, but also perhaps healthcare, also perhaps transportation and things like that, and how a fair, unequal economy with competitive outcomes that reward contribution, it can depend on the extent to which you've enabled business investment through infrastructure in a place. It can depend on nimble labor market regulation, an effective justice system that gets things through quickly, and many other things that we talk about in the book. Vitally, we see inputs to social mobility like these things as complements and not substitutes. So what that means, for example, is that you cannot fix a terrible education system by investing more in transport infrastructure. You would actually have to go and fix your schools. And what this means is that it is not sufficient to simply lay out a list of best practices. If you're a policymaker in a particular country or a particular region, you have so many inputs that could go wrong and that are complements and not substitutes that you have to diagnose what are the specific missing inputs that most severely constrain social mobility in your country or your region. And to any policymakers in the audience concerned with the leveling up agenda, this is perhaps the #1 selling point of the book for you. In order to execute that kind of systematic thinking about identifying those top constraints, we extend the diagnostic method practiced by Harvard University's Growth Lab, where I work. The diagnostic method is traditionally applied to the problem of economic growth, where we've been doing that since the early 2000s. But in the book, we show how you can extend that to the issue of low economic opportunity and low social mobility. And the book deals with this in detail, but I'll sketch out sort of an outline of the major steps for you, of which there are 4. First, identifying a sort of framing analytical question. Second, searching for symptoms of inputs that are in high demand and low supply due to some underlying blockage. Third, positing a syndrome that explains why you're stuck in a bad equilibrium. And then only finally turning to the policy therapeutics that you might apply. First, vitally, when you pose a framing question, you should not suggest an answer. So, for example, a good question would be, what holds back economic opportunity in British regions? You wouldn't want to implicitly include something that would suggest a solution, like through economic diversification or through infrastructure investment or what have you. You just start with the bare bones question. Second, you search for symptoms of just a handful of the top most constrained inputs that are in high demand and low supply. And this is very, very important, because in a lot of times in policy analysis, people will search only for a sign that something is in low supply. But in fact, something could be in low supply specifically because demand is also low. You could imagine 2 scenarios, for example. Say you're thinking of region A, where in region A, there are few places in university education and the payoff to university education is high. And then it would make sense to expand places in university education. You would see a large payoff. You could imagine another region, region B, where there could also be few places in university education, but the payoff is very low. And then it would make a lot less sense. And you might want to think of other areas of the policy debate to focus on. Now, in the book, we go into detail about the kind of data you can look for and how to execute that. But the point is that you should look for data signals that point toward a situation like the first one, and then home in on a couple of the top most binding constraints. Once you've identified those couple of critical blockages, you posit a syndrome, because after all, it's very unusual that a sorely needed input should be in low supply. So you can look for the deeper sort of political, institutional, and cultural reasons why a place is stuck in a bad equilibrium. And then finally, once you're cognizant of all that analytical input, you can turn it then to the therapeutics, where you can think of the practical solutions you may apply. And there it's important to be very pragmatic. A first or best solution may not always be political for any number, may not always be politically feasible or technically feasible, but a fourth or fifth best solution, a fourth or fifth best solution can still help a lot. With that, I'd like to thank you for giving me the time to speak. Here again is that discount code for the book, INE21 on politybooks.com. I'll turn it over to the rest of the discussion. Thank you so much.
Eric, thank you very much, and thank you to Paul for that fantastic presentation, which I thought summarised some really deep thinking in your book in an incredibly quick and efficient manner. And there was a huge amount in there for us to get into. So that's a brilliant introduction to the session. I'm now going to come to Paula Surridge, who's written more than most of us on kind of popular sympathies, at least in the UK, and what might be driving different sources of voter disenchantment. Paula, I suspect you'll want to focus largely on the kind of UK context, but just really interested in your initial reflections on some of Eric and Paul's thinking and the extent to which these or this kind of hypothesis and some of the evidence that they present applies in the UK context. To what extent is fairness rather than inequality one of the driving forces of some of the volatility that we've seen in recent elections here? So Paula, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks to Eric and Paul for the presentation and the fascinating research in the book itself. Now, I should probably start my remarks by saying that my disciplinary background is quite different to Eric and Paul's. I'm a political sociologist, so I tend to be starting at a slightly different level of analysis. My starting point is always within the electorate with their values and identities. So my approach is a little different, but I think actually we still end up with some common ground in terms of some of the arguments being made. And And I've been thinking about this in relation to divisions in British politics, even though I would perhaps get to the conclusions via a slightly different route. So I wanted to begin with some observations about populism itself, which may not be familiar to the audience, particularly if you're starting from a slightly different position. And these are obviously covered in parts of the book, less so in the presentation. And if we think about populism defined in its sort of purest form, it's in some sense ideologically neutral. And I think that's quite important because people assume that populism has a particular place in the ideological landscape. So it doesn't direct us to the left or to the right. It doesn't even necessarily direct us along the kind of culture wars axis, although it does tend to lead us to one end of it. But what it sets up is this binary between the pure people and the evil elites. And I think two things really stem from that in terms of where our politics has gone, or where our politics in the UK might be going, and politics in the US has perhaps gone. And that's it sets up from the very beginning in groups and out groups. And it does that beyond the elites being the out group, because it sets up who the pure people are. And in that sense, I think there's some further discussion to be had, perhaps political strategy discussion rather than economic policy discussion, about who the people are and who therefore is entitled to fair outcomes and who isn't entitled to fair outcomes because they're not part of the people. And I think one thing we've seen over the last 10 years is that this idea of who the people are is very malleable and very easily defined by political forces who want to use it in particular ways. So I think there's another conversation to have about how economic fairness and who is entitled to economic fairness is used by political actors. I know in the book you use the idea of scapegoats for the outgroups, the people who get blamed for the economic ills. But I think it also helps us to explain why populism has found it easy to mobilize around slogans such as "Make America Great Again," because it can play on people's fears and it can help define who the people are. And there's a really great quote included in the book, which I'm going to read if that's okay, for people that haven't read the book. The government, and this is a swing voter who voted for Trump in 2016. The government never helped me, but I was okay with that. I made mistakes, had some scary moments, and my wife worked at the local library to help out. I paid my bills, including my doctor bills. Now I see my tax dollars going to handouts for others who didn't work as hard as I did, and I can't afford my healthcare. Everyone is being taken care of but me. I feel left out. And then this is the twist at the end, and it makes me feel that I want my country back. And it's how those two ideas become linked together in people's minds, which makes this so powerful as a political strategy for people who want to exploit it, often for their own ends. It also really reminded me of some work we did at UK and a Change in Europe with a group that we called the comfortable leavers. So these were people who voted leave in the EU referendum, but who were on above median income. So they weren't, as you point out, they weren't the low income voters that some people have characterized as being the leave vote or the populist vote. And this was what one of them said in one of our focus groups. The English are feral. They were fed for years and years of, if you stubbed your toe, you got disability living allowance for the rest of your life. The English need to be retrained that to feed your family, if you have to go and scrub toilets, that's what you do. And what struck me from both of these, and I've got lots of other examples that are perhaps, in slightly less stark language, it's this idea, these ideas which feature in Nick's book as well, of family, working hard and contribution. And we pick that up in lots of different focus groups, and how we harness those ideas and make people feel that those things are valued again, I think is certainly important to the voters that I've studied in the UK, but seems to be very much tapping the same themes, albeit coming from a different angle. Now, the starting point for Eric and Paul's analysis is that we should take populist voters seriously and understand their concerns. And this is something that I've occasionally been shouted at for speaking about in the British context in relation to the economically left-leaning voters, but those that are not necessarily also in the liberal part of the attitude spectrum. But I think what we also have to do, and I think this is really important, is to move beyond seeing these groups in binary terms. And one thing almost all analysis, economic and political, does is to use vote for a populist party as a measure of populism. And I get that we have to use what we can measure. So that's that. But I think in doing that, we assume A, that all those voters are populist, and B, that there aren't kind of gradations of populism. So we lose, I think, some of the power to actually understand populism because we characterize people as one or the other. In the British context, we can dig deeper into this using individual survey data. So again, a different kind of approach to the one you're using. The British election study asks a series of questions which allows you to measure populism itself as a latent value. Sorry, I'm just slipping into modelling language there. And I know I risk being caught in what you describe in the book as the attitudes and attitudes trap, but I think it's still worth looking at this data because it does tell us something interesting. So the typical items used to measure the populist values are things like the people and not politicians should make our most important policy decisions. The politicians need to follow the will of the people. So it strips out those other ideological dimensions to try and get at a populist mindset, if we can call it that. And I've done some work linking that to sort of basic demographic characteristics. And here we find that by far the strongest relationship is with education level, and particularly this difference between graduates and non-graduates. And again, reflecting what you argue in the book about income inequality, there's only a very weak relationship with income as a simple sort of relative scale. So you'd be forgiven for moving from that data to thinking that populism might have roots in something other than raw economic self-interest. And I think that confirms to some extent the approach in the book that just looking at what we might usually think of as economics is too simplistic and doesn't help us get at this. You also find that these populist values are correlated with both the economic left-right, where the left are more populist than the right, and also the kind of authoritarian values of the type that Norris and Inglehart talk about and that you talk about in the book, where I think none of us are surprised to find that the more authoritarian are more populist. But what we end up with in the electorate is this complex pattern of beliefs in which we've got left and right populists, left and right authoritarians, and more and less populist groups. And obviously the whole point of a statistical model is to reduce some of that complexity, and that's really important. But I think it also, perhaps we're missing a trick in all of us in our analysis by not thinking of populism as more of a continuous measure, so that we get a bit more power to understand where people sit on that scale. So I just got a couple more remarks. I think the influence of education level is something we really haven't fully grasped. And I suspect it's tied up with fairness, but also social status. And I'd be really interested in how you think about that relationship between fairness and social status and how that might have changed over time. Before I was a political researcher, or in between journeys as political researcher, I was an educational researcher. And so I've been interested in education effects on politics for a really long time, and I puzzle over it a lot. And I think this is a sphere where the economic and the cultural really interact. So you've got stuff in the book, really great stuff in the book about how you can tackle the fact that the education system is deeply unequal, and the book's really, really clear about that. But I think one thing that we also need to remember is that education outcomes aren't only about economic inputs, and there's parts of our education system that value and reward particular types of cultural assets. And I think sometimes it might be unfairness about those kinds of influences rather than economic unfairness that might be driving some of this. So I'm going to abuse my position and ask Eric and Paul a question, which is whether you think if it were possible to create some kind of fairness index, would that perform better at predicting populism than the measure of social mobility? Or is it something specific about social mobility that you think is actually driving this. And finally, I thought I'd try and think through what some of the implications of this are for British politics right now. The first thing that I think I'll just have to park for a moment is what some of this might mean for political disengagement. Having voted for populist outcomes, having tried to sort of break the system in some way by doing something different, if change doesn't happen, does that just drive further political disengagement? But I think that's a topic for a different day. Is this a warning for the Conservative Party that it's critical for their policies coming out of the pandemic to be seen as fair? And I think that's a really big issue at the moment for us as we pay for the pandemic and as we emerge from the pandemic. So do those policies need to be fair because voters prize fairness and a party seen as unfair will be unattractive? Or, and now I'm being a little bit provocative, so please excuse me, if we could think of the Conservatives as the most populist party currently on offer in the UK, is it actually in the interest of the party to promote less fair policies because that will turn more people populist and therefore push them into their column? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. That was incredibly rich and thought-provoking. And I see Eric has been writing down lots of your questions to answer in a moment. But before he does, I'm going to hand over to Nick. Nick, very interested in your thoughts on all of this.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I like the book. I've read it. I want to congratulate Eric and Paul for a really important contribution. And I wanted to echo what they said and also what Paula said, because you quite often, the language of populism is bandied around quite a lot for political purposes. And I sort of think populism is a political method and it's not a program. And once you think of it in those terms, it's easier to avoid some of the rabbit holes. I love the language of fairness as well. I was recently at a dinner with a friend of mine, actually, who's a pollster, and somebody said, "How do you distinguish the English from others? How do the English perceive themselves?" And straight away the answer came back: sense of fair play and fairness. And his argument was it's a very innate thing, certainly in England in particular. But obviously, what we mean by fairness when we talk about it can differ. But fairness, unless you're a member of the ideological left, does not necessarily mean the eradication of inequality. And I think this is one of the really important points that the book makes. And, you know, I'm a conservative. I agree that inequality is not only inevitable, it's actually within certain boundaries desirable, and something that I think members of the public understand because it reflects different talents, efforts, and choices. So you won't be surprised to know I'm not here to criticize the book, but to praise the contribution. So I just wanted to pose a few questions, which I think you might think, Eric and Paul, you've addressed in the book, but I think it would be nice to sort of tease them out and discuss a little bit. The first thing is, it's obviously quite difficult to identify a single cause or theme in what is quite a complicated story, and some factors might be primary, some might be secondary, some might be a kind of catalyst, some might compound others. So overall, and I don't know if you'll agree with this, is what we're talking about actually a sense of loss? So a loss in terms of the fundamental deal that people thought they had living in a Western country, that their kids would do better than them, that they'd have a fair chance to do well, and that their kids would be able to go as far as talent and effort would allow them. But is it also that there's a perception of something lost in cultural terms? That might be partly perception of economic importance in terms of the loss of sort of local companies and things like that as the world economy has changed shape. But it might also be in terms of the radical changes in terms of the diversity of society. So not just ethnic and cultural identities, but also in terms of like radical differences in values. And if we think of it as loss, does that help us to understand how these things end up relating with one another? These causal factors relate with one another. I think some academics talk about the concept of relative deprivation, where the sense of economic and cultural loss interact with one another, and people compare their fortunes with other groups of people. The second question is, if the prescription is better social mobility, which is something I support, and it's kind of the story of my life, so I'd be a hypocrite if I if I didn't. Is one of the things constraining social mobility, in fact, actually a lack of social solidarity? There are lots of studies that show high correlations between social trust and social mobility. So membership of clubs and associations, the absence of racial and economic divisions, the ability for people to mix between classes seem to matter more in these studies than even things that you would put quite high up the list, like education spending. So isn't there a paradox with social mobility? So the key to trying to achieve social mobility is actually to try to think beyond it, where we need to try to build a society that actually succeeds in building a better common life. And related isn't, while inequality itself is not necessarily something we should eradicate, is there a point with inequality where if it becomes quite sharp, if it's really entrenched and difficult to address, then doesn't actually that make a mockery of the idea of equality of opportunity? And then the third question, I suppose, is a little bit more fundamental about the very idea of social mobility and meritocracy, or whatever term you want to give it. And is social mobility, is meritocracy just going to end up eating itself? And not just, it's very fashionable to talk about Michael Young, who coined the term meritocracy, and it was a criticism and so on and so on. So this question isn't about sort of one of his fears, where he worried that heredity and merit might come together and you end up with this kind of like genetic divide of super talented people and super not talented people. But because we're basically telling too many of our citizens that in a way, they're not needed, they're not worth it, they're not contributing. And actually they themselves feel they're not contributing. I think this is related to Paula's points about social status. So, so do we need, I think it's Michael Sandel who coined this phrase, but do we need not just a sort of typical idea of distributive justice, where you have a little bit of redistribution within the tax system and public spending, but contributive justice, where actually we're trying to make sure that that far more of our citizens are playing an active and positive and contributive part in our society. And my voice held out. I've got a cold.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick. And some really interesting thoughts there. Lots that actually, in some ways, echoes some of the questions that Paula posed as well. And there's a kind of a very strong sense, I think, that that we need to think quite clearly about what we're talking about when we talk about social mobility and some of the implications of that. But before I come back to Eric and Paul, can I just say to anyone listening in online, please do pose your questions in the Q&A and the chat, because after Eric and Paul have responded to Paula and Nick's points, I will be taking questions from the floor. So if you have questions, please do ask them. Eric, can I come back to you and Paul now for some responses if you have them?
Yeah, absolutely. Just about the time, how much time would you like us to take? Maybe to 9:50?
Yeah, something like that would be great.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, first of all, Paula and Nick, thank you so much. Those are all incredibly insightful points and really, really good questions. I think, you know, since a lot of the commentary does cover a lot of ground, I'm going to sort of focus on some of the main questions in particular that you guys posed, although I will note there certainly is a lot of synergy between, say, the research that Paula has done and the work that has gone into the book. Paula, you mentioned that you know, you want our thoughts on the relationship between education, status, and fairness, and that's a really vital point. I would say that first of all, there's the really obvious point to make that education is a key component. It's not the only component, as we make clear in the book, but it's a key component of the route to social mobility. And so, you know, in many cases, it's perhaps unsurprising that there is an educational divide, as has been, you know, repeatedly proven on the literature with regard to populist attitudes. The point that our book would make, however, is that you know, it goes beyond just education alone. You know, it also could tap into other factors that influence a person's life trajectory and whether they feel like they've been unfairly held back by success. With regard to status, this is an argument that comes up sometimes, for example, in Francis Fukuyama's book, Identity, where you know, there's the perception that it's all about the loss of some sort of like previously privileged status in society. I think the way that I would think about it at the very least is that there can, in a sense, be a threat to status that's part and parcel of an unfair economic system, but it's not, as is often discussed about, you know, there are these threatening newcomers that are going to come in and displace me. I don't think we see it quite in that particular way, but rather we see it as maybe something where, you know, in a way that's sort of related to some of the other questions that came up. There's a possibility of the loss of status in the sense of being able to, you know, live a good life and give a good life to your children in a way that's not necessarily envious of other people or thinking that you're being displaced per se. But I think, you know, we would certainly see that a threat to, you know, the ability to live a good life and live life on your own terms. A threat to that kind of status would certainly be vitally important.
Let me just jump in there. So
sure.
When you talk about the opportunity that the conservatives have right now, I mean, what we would argue is that there's this huge chance to frame the policy agenda around the idea of fairness. And I'm actually thinking that a lot of people that voted in typical areas that didn't vote conservative are expecting them not to deliver on that basis. And this is the way you kind of surprise the electorate. And what's interesting, what Nick said, I think he kind of answered your question, because there is this deep cultural sense, this innate sense of fairness, this idea of fair play. I think that's the platform upon which these policies can be run out. Mm-hmm. And to Nick's last question, the way I think about it, and the way Eric and I've talked about it a lot over the last 3 years, is the importance of choice. And Eric touched on that. So how do you create a policy agenda which gives people the real sense that they live their lives on their own terms as much as possible? I mean, there's lots of things we can't do, but the real deep sense that they're living life on their own terms, and that the state is furnishing them with the tools to do that. And by creating a community of people who feel that way, then everyone is part of that uplifting. And the societies that are successful from a social mobility perspective and haven't had to deal with deep populist eruptions, despite the risks around some of those things, in fact, they're the ones who end up in the best place. So it's this idea of living life on your own terms.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Paul. I would just add to slightly expand on Paula's question pertaining to the electoral strategy for the Tories. I mean, you know, there all are politicians that run on just a purely cynical populist angle. Think of Donald Trump in the US. But, you know, I think I speak for both of us when I say that I think the Tories would face best, durable chances of electoral success if they really delivered on fairness, like taking the leveling up agenda very seriously and creating a fairer and more socially mobile economy for all. I mean, that gets you out of the division, that wins the hearts of so many people. I think that's the grand slam approach. Nick, I loved the quote you gave. I know Paul mentioned it about the sense of fair play in England, and I think that's something that is so true and so in need of rebuilding. When you mentioned that it can be difficult to tease apart the causal channels that ultimately lead to populism, because there are so many complicated things going on. One thing that may not have been clear in the slides for you, those of you in the audience, but something that we elaborate upon in the book, is that we see like economic unfairness as the sort of like main driving force toward populism, but we see there being room for accelerating and augmenting factors. Yeah, things like the culture wars spilling over. I mean, you can think of how there are lots of countries with very high rates of social media use that are not populist, but in the ones that are populist, it's certainly, it's hard to imagine that sort of thing helps. So that's sort of the way we see it, that there's this main driving force and then these augmenting factors. Paula and Nick, I felt you had sort of complementary questions about the idea of sort of like a fairness index, and also Nick, your questions about things that might constrain social mobility that could be drawn from factors like trust. I would say that one thing our book points toward, speaking somewhat more to Paula's angle, is a study by Sergei Guriev, where he decomposes income inequality in post-Soviet states into unfair determinants, things like, not just family wealth, but also a person's gender and their ethnicity and things like that. So social mobility, it really focuses in on the family wealth angle, but there's scope for additional things as well. It just depends on the data availability ultimately.
Thank you so much.
Pretty well.
Sorry, Eric, that was a fantastic response to a number of different questions, and thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the floor now, and I'm going to pose these both to Eric and Paul, but also to Nick and Paula as well, because I'm interested in kind of bringing them in and allowing them to respond before we finish too. So we've had one question from an anonymous attendee, actually, rather than someone who's given their name, but talking about the phrase that I think Michael Gove has used in this country about the importance of being able to stay local and go far. And Nick alluded to this in his remarks, the kind of idea of being able to go as far as your talents will take you. And there has been a bit of a perception in this country, I think, for some time, that social mobility means leaving your home and actually going quite several hundred miles away from your home if you live in the north of England to get to London or to go to Oxbridge or wherever, and that we've defined social mobility in quite exclusive and kind of literally geographically mobile terms. And so there was just a question of, to what extent do you define social mobility as related to place, I guess, is a kind of interesting question. I'd be interested in Paula and Nick's views on that as well, and whether or not actually a different view of social mobility might be necessary, or different definition might be necessary in order to respond to populism. And there was another question from Ed Goodall, which touches on something you get into a bit in the book, which is the extent to which kind of spatial geography and particularly, I guess, the UK's kind of regional imbalances, including with regard to kind of a lack of devolved power and control over policy and taxation and things like that, contributes to the sense of unfairness that you articulate, and whether or not some of the UK's kind of more, if we can use that term, populist tendencies have actually been driven by over centralization in one part of the country in particular, both in terms of decision making, but also in terms of the kind of economic engine that also drives. And we've done lots of research showing that London has kind of increasingly eaten up more of the pie over the last 10, 20 years, which may have contributed to some of those kind of populist tendencies. So perhaps if I can come to, I'm actually going to go in reverse order, and I can come to Nick first, then Paula, and then ask Eric and Paul to give the last word, if that's right. Nick.
Thanks. That means I won't have forgotten what I was planning to say by the time you get to me. Well, I think that these are really important questions that get to the heart of it. And on the issue about social mobility and leaving home, I remember Morris Glassman saying we define success in society by how far away we live from our mums, which is quite a sort of, I think it's actually partly true, and it's quite a miserable way of putting it, because it shows what social mobility does in terms of pulling family bonds and social bonds. But I think whether you think, and you just did this a little bit, Will, you sort of said, well, especially if you live in the north, then it might mean having to move a couple of 100 miles away. It does depend a little bit on what we mean about social mobility, and the debate about social mobility is quite often defined by people who have quite extraordinary social mobility stories themselves, because they're now elites in the media or in politics or whatever. And so the story of social mobility is often seen as, well, I went to my local comprehensive and then I got into Oxford, and look at me now, I'm a cabinet minister, which is obviously a really, really unusual and dramatic story. And for a lot of people, social mobility is actually just a little bit incremental. If you manage to escape low pay, 10 years after you were in it, or you didn't have any qualifications. Do your children have BTECs or sort of GCSEs and A levels? So actually the story is more is less grandiose for most people, I think. And obviously there should be more opportunities, both in the grandiose sense, but also in the more modest sense in the localities. And there was another Michael Gove quote which summed this up quite well, I think, which is, you shouldn't have to leave the place you love to lead the life you want, which I think gets at the heart of it. But this takes me on to my sort of biggest bugbear with the way conservatives have tended to talk about social mobility through my lifetime, I think, which is to talk about social mobility in the context of escape. So Justine Greening, when she was Education Secretary, talked about how she always grew up in Rotherham knowing there was something better out there, which was a bit of a fuck you to Rotherham and the people of Rotherham. And I think that's not only politically dumb, because you should go around telling people that they live in a shithole. Sorry, I'm swearing for early in the morning. It's also not right. We should be trying to give people opportunities in Rotherham and around Rotherham, and we should be thinking not just about helping a small number of talented people to escape, but improving the circumstances of everybody who lives everywhere in the country.
Nick, thank you very much. Paula, can I come to you now?
Yes, thank you. I always thought I'd draw a little bit on my kind of sociological background to talk about social mobility. And we had a period from about the 1950s where we had an extraordinary restructuring of society, which meant there were a lot more opportunities at the top, and social mobility as a policy becomes relatively easy because people can move up into those spaces. We're not in that space anymore. And one thing all these discussions about social mobility seem to miss is that for this fairness to happen, some people have got to move down. You can't just have everybody moving up. And that seems to get lost a little bit in this discussion of what fairness is. It seems to assume it's making everybody's life better, but there aren't enough spaces at the top for that to be true. I also wanted to just go back, sorry, it is a little bit of a kind of a hobby horse of mine on education, and this kind of stay local, go far, and I think Eric mentioned it in his presentation that, fixing inequalities in education is not done by infrastructure projects. And I'm thinking of that in the kind of levelling up agenda and the context of HS2 and the debates that are going on here. And it's harder to fix education. It's less visible. And it's a longer process. I mean, I know it takes a long time to build a railway, but it's a long process to fix what's going on in education in primary schools now, to have fair outcomes for people when they're adults. And so therefore the incentives, I think, are not necessarily there to do that work of making education outcomes fair, when you can spend the money on something that has a much more immediate electoral payoff. And I think that's a tension in some of this as well, that what we're talking about are things that are really long-term projects, and they're not going to perhaps have the payoff electorally for this government or even the next. So there, I think there's some disincentives to doing the work that would actually help built into our political system. I'll keep it brief because I want to hear from Eric and Paul.
Thanks, Paula. Just on the point of long-termism, there's a wonderful statistic in the book that says that Italy has had, I think, 65 governments since the Second World War, versus Britain's 25. And just the point about kind of how to drive long-term change through society, that type of kind of chopping and changing politically is kind of clearly very unhelpful. Anyway, Eric and Paul, I will give the last word to you. You've only really got kind of 2 or 3 minutes, I'm afraid, but very interested in what you've got to say. And thank you so much again for joining us today.
Beautiful. So I'll be very brief. In the 5th chapter of the book, we do sort of these miniature case studies where we diagnose the different reasons for low social mobility and economic unfairness in different countries, including the UK. Our view is pretty well that you have to increase opportunity and you have to increase social mobility locally in regions in the UK if you want to boost social mobility overall. There's been huge perennial investment into London, and yet social mobility in Britain remains low. It's there. You can see in the book, there's so many clear indicators in the data that over centralization, has led to limited economic opportunity. And even if you think it's acceptable for people to have to move to boost social mobility, in practice, it doesn't work very well in the UK. The other thing, I think Paul has a point about choice.
Yeah, I mean, it's always seemed to me that if you're investing in economic fairness to improve social mobility, what you really do is you're giving people choice. So it's one thing to say, I can't live a life beyond my own neighborhood for whatever reason, because I didn't get good schooling, or the economy doesn't work, or there's no transportation links. It's another thing to say, I'm choosing to stay in my neighborhood. I'm choosing to stay here and make my life, because I'm making that decision on my own terms. And highly mobile societies where there's high levels of social mobility and economic fairness, there's lots of evidence that that's the case. Places like the Nordics, Canada, and Australia, that's the conversation. And the countries where that's not the case, they're the ones that face the populist eruption, and they're the ones that need to reclaim populism.
Fantastic. We are right on time, so I'm not going to try and sum up the discussion. It's been enormously rich. You can revisit it on YouTube if you want to go back to anyone's comments and write down all the brilliant quotes and statistics that have been cited throughout. But Paul and Eric, thank you so much for coming to talk about your book. As Eric said, it's available, I think, in all good bookstores, but also on Polity Press with that discount code. And thank you so much to Nick and Paula for giving up an hour of your mornings to discuss it as well. It's a really brilliant contribution and something I'm sure that we'll be citing in onwards research in future. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you.